This is a book review on Jeffrey Martin's The Finders. Hello, this is Chris speaking. Wake up with another book review, this time about The Finders by Dr. Jeffrey A. Martin. This is a very hard book to review. It's very difficult because it has two faces. And for a long time I wondered if I should review it or mention the contents of the book at all. The reason is that it is clearly written in a spell dynamics terms orange context. But it is about second tier. It is about enlightenment. It is about higher stages of consciousness, states of consciousness, dynamics of consciousness. But it is written from a mainstream natural sciences point of view. And as thus, it can only get to a certain point. It actually surprisingly gets far. It paints a very good picture of consciousness, of what in spiral dynamics is called second tier, better than spiral dynamics itself. And indeed, the person who recommended it to me initially said this guy managed to do for spiral dynamics second tier what spiral dynamics was able to do for first tier. First tier in spiral dynamics is the development of personality, whereas spiral dynamics second tier is the development of the soul, of consciousness, whatever you want to call it, of the journey towards enlightenment. So, there was a team of psychologists headed by Jeffrey Martin who wanted to find out more about this consciousness thing that so many gurus and teachers talk about and have talked about for many years and decades and centuries. So they did the next sensible thing. They interviewed a lot of those people who claimed to be in a higher state of consciousness, and then tried to find several stages. Now, what spiral dynamics does in 6 stages from yellow upwards, and on the Hawkins scale from about 300 upwards, 300 to 700, let's say, Jeffrey Martin and his team called locations, which is a very good term. Let's talk about terms first here. I do like that he called people who can abide in a higher state of consciousness finders instead of seekers. Very good. Call them finders. I like it. What I don't like is that instead of enlightenment, which is of course a very misleading term, he calls it fundamental well-being. It's a nice try. And of course what he means is that a general well-being is not dependent anymore on external circumstances or inner trauma. That's why he calls it fundamental well-being. But it is misleading. The term is misleading insofar as it gives the impression that people who are in these locations feel well all the time, and that there is a certain kind of state or several states which are desirable. That there's something that you should and could want. And this is exactly not the case. So in the end, it prints a false picture, and it gives hope to spiritual bypassers. What I like very much is Jed McKenna's term human adulthood. I think that's a much more clearer picture. It's a return to normalcy, from madness to normalcy. It's not a special or higher state, it's a more normal state, a less insane state. Now, I always say that, and very few people listen to me, don't watch Jeffrey Martin's videos, and don't go on his website, and don't do his courses. Because for some reason, he managed to write a really good book without clearly having any idea what he was talking about. Sorry, if you listen to this, Jeffrey, sorry, but it's clearly from what you're writing that you yourself had no experience in this area. But still, Jeffrey and his team gleaned a lot of very useful information through the interviews. And the categorization in locations is very, very good. So, the first part of the book, the narrative self versus fundamental well-being, sounds good, but skip it. If you read the book, skip it. If you read the book, skip it. If you read the book, skip it. I can't repeat that often enough. I recommended the book to several people, and everyone reacted the same way I reacted when I first opened it. I thought it was total bullshit. And indeed, the first part is total bullshit. It is also not addressed to seekers and finders. It's addressed to orange peers. So you can skip it. It's not for you. The interesting part is part 2, the continuum, describing the locations, and then part 3 and 4, what details that came out from these interviews. And it's very, very helpful to finders or seekers or persons on the path, people in dynamic second tier, to see that they're not alone with their trials. So part 3 and 4, I think it's almost necessary to read it to avoid to fall into some pitfalls. He talks about so many interesting things, like, for example, cities and relationship problems, drugs and sex and stress, and overestimating yourself, underestimating yourself, emotions, memory, sense of self, zooming in and out. I like this very much, zooming in and out. And the other thing I already mentioned in a video, he has a knack for really useful terminology. This thing with the two paths, the path of freedom and the path of humanity, introvert and extrovert. And even something that very few people talk about, rejecting fundamental well-being or rejecting enlightenment. There are people, I've met them, who say, okay, but what's the use? I don't want it. I go back to non-enlightenment because then life is easier. That too is a very important aspect, and I'm very grateful to him, to Jeffrey and his team, that they incorporated so many very, very useful topics. So, knowing that this book is written from an orange perspective, from a so-called scientific perspective, you can read the book starting with part 2. Don't read the introduction or part 1. Start with part 2, chapter 9, the continuum emergence, page 41. This is also available as an audiobook. It's quite nice to listen to. You can even start with chapter 10, location 1. Part 2, the continuum, describes location 1, 2, 3, 4, and locations 4, 5 and beyond. These locations correspond to the colors of spiral dynamics and to the scale of 0 to 1000 of the Hawkins Scale of David Hawkins. It's a model. All of these scales are models, so they have no objective reality, no objective truth, but they're useful to describe something which otherwise cannot be described. And to use all three of them gives a multidimensionality that then paints quite a clear picture. So I already made videos about spiral dynamics and about Hawkins, and also about comparing spiral dynamics and Hawkins. And this is the third system I use regularly to pin down where some information is coming from. Especially interesting is location 3. But I don't want to make this video too long. I will talk about the locations in another video. This is a book review and I recommend this book wholeheartedly if you listen to my advice and not to read the introduction and the first part, and don't go look for Jeffrey Martin on YouTube. This is of course what many people, the first thing they hear about someone or something, they look for examples on YouTube. In this case, don't do it. It will turn you off. Same with the website. It will extinguish your interest once and for all. So many people have recommended this book to, did exactly that. They watched a YouTube video, had a look at the website, and they said, no way, Jose, I'm not going to spend a second of my life on this bullshit. When one of my best friends recommended this book to me a long time ago, my reaction was very similar, and I seriously doubted his sanity for recommending this to me. But then he said, please try again, and if you can't stomach the first chapter, start with chapter 10. And that's what I did, and immediately saw the immense potential. Again, I don't think that the authors really understood back then what they had found and what they were describing, because they were describing it on the basis of interviews, not on the basis of their own experience. But that can also be an advantage. So for anyone interested in spiral dynamics, I recommend to look at the locations. And for anyone who is on the path and struggles with it, because I've never known anyone, I've never met anyone who doesn't struggle with it. As Susan Siegel calls it, the collision with the infinite. It's tough. It's tough. And most of the time it has nothing to do with any kind of well-being. Most of the time it's harrowing. So for all those, I recommend part 3 and 4, because there's so much useful information in there, and thus also things you can avoid just by having heard about it. There's so many descriptions there that no one else so far has described in this completeness and detail. In spiral dynamics terms, this book ranges from orange to coral, and in Hawkins Scale terms, this book calibrates at about 200 to 400. And the locations of this book, choosing its own system to describe it, is location 1, 2, 3. But it is full of gems and gold nuggets. It's really, really worth reading it, part 2, 3, and 4. The attempt at all to write a book like this is praiseworthy and laudable. So thank you very much to Dr. Martin and his team. Well done. I think it's very similar to what Claire Graves tried to do with spiral dynamics. But as we all know, he only arrived at yellow and turquoise, not further. So he only described 2 stages, the 2 first stages of the development of the soul. While Jeffrey Martin and his team managed to describe 5 stages and possibly more, plus through all these interviews, all these commonalities and differences and shades and nuances and problems, advantages and disadvantages you can encounter on the path towards finding Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for joining me on Patreon. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Thank you for sharing this video with your friends. Please leave your comments below if you read the book already, how you like it, and see you soon.